more than you should ever see in a shelter in Tucson on any given day. However, if we were to pull back attention at the federal level, stop working on legislation, pull back resources, we can guarantee that the next surge will come when we're not prepared for it. So this is the time for us to actually make sure our colleagues understand the situation and prepare for both appropriate implementation of current law as well as changes to legislation to close this asylum loophole so the cartels can no longer take advantage of it.
All right, KLD.
I guess what would be a solution you think is acceptable from the federal government to move forward and to assist the communities down here in Southern Arizona?
Oh, we have lots of ideas. Do you want to talk about the work you're doing on asylum?
Yeah, we have to be able to clarify what asylum means. That's the biggest loophole that we have in the federal system right now, is that people coming across requesting asylum that we really know in law don't actually qualify for asylum, but they're being released in the country and sometimes waiting years to be able to get a decision to say, no, you don't qualify. But then there's all kinds of issues there where they've been there so long. So we've got to be able to clarify asylum. We've got to be able to make sure we take care of humanitarian issues in the meantime. But we've got to be able to make sure we're closing that loophole and providing clarity who does qualify for asylum and who doesn't.
It's important to know that right now, because of this loophole in the asylum law, it is cartels like the Sinaloa cartel who choose who comes into the country, through what venue, and when. It's not the American government choosing that. And that's why it's so important to close this loophole. We also need to ensure that we have adequate and appropriate, well-trained and appropriately managed border security. You all know that in the Tucson sector right now, the amount of fentanyl that's coming in between ports of entry, that's being smuggled in by the cartels, exceeds what is being caught at the port of entry in the Tucson sector. That's not a mistake. It is intentional that while resources are being diverted to processing individuals through the broken asylum system, that fentanyl is continuing to come in at a faster and faster pace. So part of what we must do legislatively is provide appropriate resources and technology for our CBP agents across the southern border to stop both the illegal flow of drugs, but also the flow of individuals who are security risks to our country.
NBC News.
Senator Lankford to you, and then Senator Sinema. Why do you think joining a bipartisan trip to the border is different from going, for example, with all Republicans? And what have you gleaned from this experience?
Yeah, so I've been multiple times to the border in a bipartisan trip. Obviously, it's helpful for people, multiple parties, to be able to talk, look at the same set of facts, and not argue about the facts. When we're actually able to look at the situation and say, okay, here's what everyone's telling us. At the same time, it gives us an opportunity to be able to talk afterwards and say, that's a problem we've got to be able to resolve. If you can at least agree on what the problem is, you can start arguing about what the solutions are and to try to figure it out, but at least you're working on the same problem. Sometimes when you end up in an all-Democrat trip or an all-Republican trip, or I guess an all-independent trip, then you end up looking at things that are lined up with what your perspective is instead of seeing a whole.
That's right.
And Senator Sinema, to you, do you think the administration has been upfront with the American people as just to how bad this crisis has become?
No. Several weeks ago, we actually heard testimony from Secretary Mayorkas in our committee, the Homeland Security Committee, where he was unwilling to say that this is a crisis. Just several weeks later, I held a hearing in that same committee, the Border Subcommittee. Senator Lankford and I brought in individuals to testify, including the Pima County Deputy Supervisor, who talked about the fact that this was a crisis. During that hearing, each one of the witnesses, including the mayor of Yuma, Arizona, and the mayor of Sierra Vista, Arizona, were asked, is this a crisis? Every single person acknowledged in one word, yes. The reality is we are facing a crisis. And so while some, as Jose mentioned, are saying that the surge hasn't been as bad as it was anticipated, what you've heard here today from the folks who are on the ground is that we are still managing a crisis every single day. The town of Nogales does not have the ability to manage 100 individuals from African nations released into the streets of that small community. This is a crisis for every border community. And it is incumbent on the federal government to enforce our current laws, as well as communicate effectively and honestly with all of our partners at the local level. And it is Congress's responsibility to change the broken legal system so that we don't have this problem moving forward.
Univision.
Are the southern border communities, the rural prepared for another search?
Absolutely not. You know, several weeks ago, when I introduced legislation that would extend the authorities of Title 42 for an additional 2 years to give the Biden administration another chance to actually prepare for the end of it, which they did not do preceding this end of Title 42, I gave the example of Naco. Naco is a small town in southern Arizona with a population of less than 900 people. If there are street releases in Naco, there is literally nowhere for those migrants to go. There are no corridors of transportation. There aren't opportunities for them to find hotels and stay overnight. It is a very small town. And I continue to remind folks that in southern Arizona, our border communities are very different than those that you see in either Texas or California. Many folks here in Arizona will remember just a year and a half ago, when there were migrants released in small communities, the mayor of Gila Bend put migrants in his personal vehicle and drove them into Phoenix so that they could get dropped off at the shelter in Phoenix, because there is one stoplight in Gila Bend, no shelter, nowhere for them to sleep. That is an important thing to remember. So when folks from other large cities around the country say, gosh, it's really difficult to have large groups of migrants coming into our cities, I understand, and I'd like to invite them to Naco.
All right, guys, we'll have to wrap. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.